Okay, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. There's still a bunch of people trickling in, but let's get started. So first off, thanks a ton for carving out time to join us today. This is obviously a pretty specific subject, but a subject that hopefully is relevant to all of you. So excited to go through a bunch of content that we've put together. By way of introduction, my name is Grant Monroe, and sort of my co-host, co-presenter is Jeremy Vo. By background, so I'm an engineer, worked in product management for sort of north of a decade in technology within B2B, and then always wanted to be an entrepreneur. And so in 2014, started a company called Flashstock in the content marketing space in Toronto. And yeah, that company grew very quickly. We grew to about 150 people over about 3.5 years, and ultimately sold the business to Shutterstock, a big public stock photo company, in 2017 for 65 million. And so with that sort of growth, uh, sort of reflecting on what we did well, what we needed to learn, Jeremy and I sort of realized that the product was, a core part of both of our futures. And so, really interested in that space and how it's evolving. And so we agreed to start these roundtable series where we really just explore sort of problems that product people are facing every day, and then sort of work with them to come up with solutions and share those solutions across the board. And so we're doing this completely independently, and this is our third roundtable in the series. And yeah, just for context, Jeremy and I worked together closely at Flashstock, starting in 2014. He was the first employee and had sort of multiple roles, from sales to product to a small startup. You basically do everything. So why this workshop? I just wanted to frame it to give everyone context. So for those of you who are able to participate in some of our other roundtables, this will be a bit repetitive, but for others, just to set the stage. So after we sold the business and got stopped working at the buying company, we decided to sort of invest our sort of time and knowledge around like what product capabilities we want to build as individuals. And so as part of that, we thought it'd be really useful to connect with a community of people in an acknowledged space that's changing really, really quickly. And so the first roundtable that we did was back in July, and all we did was we reached out to about 55 heads of product, chief product officers from B2B, and did some discovery on them to try to understand what their biggest challenges were. And so across those interviews, we basically grouped together the problems across three themes. So the first theme was customer knowledge gap. So, if you're building a product for a B2B customer, you're likely not doing their job. And so you have to fill that knowledge gap in some other way. And that's really, really challenging. The second theme is when product organizations are building product, making sure that everyone outside of product and in product really understands the why they're building. So what does that core customer need? And then the third big theme was, how do you show the organization who's not familiar with product all the demands on product relative to all the things that they could do and what they ultimately they choose to do. So of those three things, those are the big themes that came out. So then if you look at theme 1 and 2, it really boils down to understanding the customer need. And so we took the sort of output of that roundtable and we did our second roundtable, which was really trying to get a lay of the land of how B2B organizations benchmark themselves in context of discovery. And so one of the things we learned was, the nomenclature around discovery is quite varied. So when we say customer discovery, it's a product person that's going out to a customer or a target customer and trying to learn something. And so it's like a dedicated practice that they're proactively going out trying to learn something. It's not, sitting in a sales meeting or sort of interviewing the sales leader to find out what the feature requests are. It's this sort of proactive exercise, because we feel that's the best way to learn about the market and your customer. And so we benchmarked 50 companies and basically figured out what they did and what they didn't do, and then compared the results. And so we built out a capabilities framework as a result of that. And so the biggest problems that emerged are listed here. Hardest part of customer discovery, and sort of the top 3 or 4 are, how do you organize the information against your customer segments in a meaningful way that's really usable by the organization? A lot of people were talking to customers, but just sort of dumping everything into these like unstructured tools like Confluence, and it wasn't really ending up going anywhere. Second one was like, how do you actually conduct a good interview without introducing all of your bias? Like, what types of questions do you ask? how do you manage the time? Like, when do you prioritize doing it versus like the immediate need, and sort of training and process. And so that was the output of number 2. And so the sort of the common theme here is this is an area where organizations need a lot of help. It's an area that they see as being a really important thing in the future, and it's an area where they want to do more of. And so, one of the things that Jeremy and I have spoken about at length is, if you look at the software landscape today, what is your true differentiator? Software is no longer a differentiator. The number of companies entering the market in any sector on any given day is pretty massive, VC funded, et cetera. So unless you're doing some sort of deep patent or proprietary data or sort of partnership APIs, you don't really have a competitive moat. And so your competitive moat becomes your ability to really understand your customer. And so we truly believe that if you can walk into a room, interview people and identify the biggest need in that room, it's pretty much a superpower, and it's probably one of the most important capabilities that any product, individual and team can have. And so that's why we decided to create this workshop. So in terms of agenda, we're going to go over a framework that we've developed from a variety of inputs, which we'll get into. We're going to do some case studies at the end. So we've done some actual work implementing this with some companies that are part of the community, and then we're also going to provide a capabilities assessment. And then also the final piece is we'll be sharing some of the templates that if you aren't implementing them, they might be helpful for you to bring back to your organization. And then we are taking questions. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please put them in the chat, either direct message to Jeremy or myself or to the group, and then we're just going to compile them and address them in order at the end of the session, if there is any. We are sending out a survey at the end of the session. Please take the time to fill that out. Again, this is a passion project for Jeremy and I, and so if these subjects are interesting to you, please let us know, because that encouragement and that feedback helps drive future work. And again, any questions, just send them directly to us. So with regards to this framework, like how we've done it, as I mentioned, we've done these 3, 2 or 3 big roundtables where each one we've talked to a minimum of 50 heads of product in B2B. And so we've been doing them really since, the first 3 months of when COVID really hit last year. And so we probably spoke to in total about 250 people. As we've been doing it, I mean, a lot of the approaches that we were using to have those interviews are discovery processes that we're going to talk about today. So we really combined the outbound sales skills that we acquired through the company that we built, Flashstock, which was very much an outbound enterprise sales cadence. Our combined product skills, our entrepreneurial experience to sort of building and selling a company, then integrating that company into a larger company, and then also talking to a lot of you and figuring out what are the things that work really well and what are the things that don't. So we put that all into a framework, and then we, based on some demand that came serendipitously, we worked with a series of companies to execute a couple of different engagements where we sort of did a couple things. We did, discovery on their behalf, and then we sort of trained their team on how to do discovery, and then we actually got some output to see how well or not the process is working, refined it a little bit, and then pretty happy with where it is today, and then ultimately created this workshop as a means to help you guys and your team. Before we get into the framework, just kind of want to frame the why. So, you're all in the industry, so creating compelling product offerings is really hard, and it's increasingly hard. Your customer, their priorities are shifting rapidly. There's more competitors in the market, and so it's more important than ever that you, as product leaders, are evaluating what you offer those customers against what you think are their needs, and then what the new areas of opportunities are. As soon as you take your eye off the ball there, you're likely going to lose out on an opportunity and lose out on that customer base. And with sort of the B2B trend on customer acquisitions going up pretty drastically over the 5 years, those are costly mistakes. A lot of the themes that came out of the interviews were around this notion of instilling this discipline within your product team to become your biggest differentiator. And so if you can understand your customer segment more than your competitor, you're in a much better position to build sort of creative and novel solutions to meet their needs. And if you can build that as a systematic capability, it's not a one and done. You're constantly doing it. You're just going to be much better off in the long run. And so that's kind of why the urgency is we need to do this now. So if you look at that the sort of the previous slide on Roundtable 2, there was really 3 big buckets of problem areas that organizations would address when thinking about how they did research. So the first one was, how do we actually get people in our target customer segment that we can talk to without too many roadblocks or obstacles? And so we've built an outbound engine framework for that. The second is, how do you do it quickly with minimal resources and get really good, quick, decisive learnings? So that's the framework that I'll go through. And then how do you do it in a way that's not resource intensive, that you can scale, so your team can do it, someone else on another team can do it? How do you make sure that you have the tools and the process and the training in place to basically be able to ramp that up or ramp that down in a moment's notice? And so the process that we'll walk through really addresses those 3 things. So here's a high level overview of the framework. I'll be diving into each one of these in detail, but just let me set the context. And so again, this is about discovery. It's about how do you proactively go out and learn about your customer so that you can do something about that. Either build new product, build a feature, tweak the pricing, build the positioning. And so the way that we find it best sets this up is creating a brief on the work that you want to do. And I'll get into the brief details. Once you've written out the brief, it's all about building the list of people you want to talk to, templatizing how you're going to reach out to them, doing the actual outreach, booking meetings, conducting the discovery interviews, and then how do you process the results in a way that's really impactful to share with the rest of your organization. That's a piece that is usually overlooked that we need to spend a bit of time on. And so if you sort of break the front half out, it's about how do you build this discovery funnel of existing and prospective customers, and the second half is how do you actually interview them to get really tangible, actionable results. The really good thing about this process is if you can do the first half really well and you can do the second half really well, if you do identify interesting and novel problems, you've already engaged a good set of customers who have self-acknowledged to have those problems. So it's much easier to sort of feed the solutions back to them. So the first part of the brief, the first part of the process is the discovery brief. And so for those of you who write a lot of things down, you'll really start to understand or appreciate the power of that activity. Having built a business in the marketing world prior, so you're working with a lot of creative people, their modem of communication is the creative brief, and people put a lot of energy and time into those documents to get them right, and there's a lot of power in them. And so we think this is an effective vehicle to do as part of your product group, where you're basically writing down what you want to learn and what the objective of your learning is. When you do that, you can start to templatize the types of brief based on what you want to learn. And so, for example, if you're launching a new product and trying to address new customer needs, you'd have a specific brief for that. If you're trying to figure out pricing, you'd have a different brief for that. If you're trying to figure out a new go-to-market, like let's say what events you should invest in, you'd want a new template for that. So the advantages of having a brief is it structures things and focuses on the pieces of information that are most critical, and it usually addresses gaps of knowledge that you don't have, and it's important that you get them. It aligns all the stakeholders into what's happening and what's doing, and because it's all there in one place, you ultimately do it faster and you get a much more decisive result. So what's in a brief? $1 million question. So we find that these are the most important aspects of a brief. The example that we're going to walk through as part of the process is for a new product launch. And so here, to set the scene, you're trying to uncover a new problem that you think your customer or target customer has so that you can build a solution for it. And so it's really focused on that. These templates will be made available at the end of the session. So the first section is learning goal. And again, this is about, for this example, it's about identifying a problem that your customer has. And so writing out a structured hypothesis in this format is really beneficial, and I'll sort of share why. So we believe the persona faces the problem because constraint, which results in the implication. And so the next part of the brief is you basically want to write out what you think that persona cares about. And so here it's your segment details, so the job title, the segment. These things are really important when you start thinking about building out your contact list. If you don't know that, you should really know that, and you should look at ways to address that knowledge gap. And then you want to understand what they're doing in their day-to-day job. So what are their priorities? What are their workflow? What are their challenges when they're trying to execute those workflows? What are the constraints that are making those challenges real? And then ultimately what the implications are. And so you're sort of writing out the story already and getting it in paper based on your best guess and the knowledge that you currently have. And so because this is a hypothesis, the problem and the challenge in the persona maps to the hypothesis. And so that you can sort of see that connection. The next piece is you want to predefine what the validation criteria is. And so we find that sort of these are your, 3 or 4 components of a validated problem. And so if I've got a problem and I'm the customer, I acknowledge that it's a problem. I believe it should be solved. I have looked for a solution. I've invested time and money in that, and I can actually articulate the impact. This stuff is really, really important, because if people acknowledge that it's a problem, but they haven't done anything about it, it's probably not a real problem. And that's the stuff that you could spend a lot of time and money chasing. And so predefining this criteria is super important. And then lastly is just sharing the logistics. So who's working on it? How many interviews do you want to do? When do we want to do it by? And then how are we presenting the results? And so we've got a series of templates to make that really easy. Here's an interview summary template. Here's how you track your meetings. And then how do you summarize it all together? And so when you have the end goal in mind, it's much easier to direct the interviews. So the next section is, once you've got your brief and your brief done, is you got to go out and build a list. And so in the brief, you're articulating a persona, and embedded in the persona is your segment details. So you need to use those segment details to build the list. And this is why job title in industry becomes so important, because if you can't articulate that, you're going to have a really hard time selling your product. And so by providing that, you can also use it to build lists. And so the next question is, how many meetings do you ultimately need to book, and how many contacts do you need to acquire? And so we find that for cold contacts, you can assume a conversion rate of about 10%. So you're reaching out to someone that you don't have a relationship with. 1 in 10 of those people will agree to have a meeting with you. And so you can use that conversion rate to estimate how many contacts for the list you need to build. And then you basically use a couple different tools to build those lists. If you have an enterprise sales team, this will be very old hat for them. So yeah, walk over and see how they do it. But you'll quickly get an appreciation of how difficult that job is. If you're going to existing customers, obviously your contact information will be in the CRM. It's super important that you talk to your sales team, because nothing pisses off a salesperson more than someone reaching out to their client without their knowledge. If it's a non-customer, so if it's a target customer that isn't a customer, LinkedIn is a great source for the majority of industries. You can also look at associations and directories, where you usually give people's information. And then you can use a series of tools to actually acquire the contact information, so their email and their phone number. These are the things that you're going to need. And tools like ZoomInfo, LinkedIn Sales Navigator, or Lead IQ, et cetera, do that for not a huge cost. And so the goal of this section is, you're going to have, let's say, 100 contacts in your target segment that are either customer or non-customer, with email, title, phone number, so that you can actually build cadences and sequences to get their attention. So that's the next piece. So now that you've got the list, which is literally just a CSV of contacts and contacts information, you need to figure out how you're going to get them on the phone for an interview. There's a bit of art here, because this does differ drastically by industry. And so, for example, if you're selling product into a digital marketing function, there's a good probability that email will be the best channel for you. If you're selling into industrial sector, so factories and shops, email is not going to work for you. Same thing with medical. It's much more likely going to be phone. And so you have to figure that out by thinking through the industry itself. We find sort of 3 to 5 touches to be the best, which means you're not sending one email and forgetting it. You're sending one email with a follow-up a couple of days, another follow-up in a couple of days, another follow-up in a couple of days, and we find we get a little conversion at that sort of 3 to 5 rate. Obviously, your customers and network is your easiest place to start, but we believe it's really important that you do reach out to cold customers, because if a cold customer or cold prospect acknowledges they have a problem and is willing to get on the phone with you as a stranger, it's a really strong sign that they are struggling with that problem. And so tracking conversion rates and seeing the differences between different campaigns and problem statements really, really is quite helpful. And then you want to templatize it, because you want to minimize the amount of rework. And so optimize outreach templates like email templates, call scripts, etc., based on the hypothesis, and you can start to A/B test the results. And so over time, as your team gets better at this, you can start to optimize conversion rates across all of those things. So ultimately, you're sending out less communication to get the same amount of meetings. Here's a sample email template just for context. You want to keep these things super short. There's a bunch of tools out there or a bunch of content out there on how to write really good cold prospecting emails. You want to dive into those, but the theme is pretty consistent. Obviously, we're not selling anything, so we want to make that super clear because people don't like to be sold to generally unless it's really important. We find this one works really well. Sort of a complimentary opening, a quick summary of the problem area. This is important because it sort of acts as a filter to make sure that the people who do respond, it's going to be a useful meeting. Asking for help, but being really sort of deferential to their experience and not pretending anything is good because people are generally good people and want to help, and if they have the time, they will. And then make a super short, simple ask at the end so that they know what they're signing up for. The next step is booking meetings. So, booking meetings is super hard. I think sales development, business development, sales prospecting is one of the hardest jobs to do in the world. It's like emotionally taxing. You get a lot of no's, but it's so valuable, especially valuable in the product management space. And you will notice that there will be certain product managers on your team that will just not want to do this, no matter what you say or do. Which is fine. You just have to make sure that does fit into the role and it fits into the organization. And if you're hiring people, making sure that they are comfortable with doing this. We find that dedicating specific times to do this sort of minimizes the pain a little bit. So you do it at a certain time in the morning or in the evening. You want to front load your outreach. And so if you're trying to get all your interviews done in the next 2 weeks, do all the outreach in the first 2 to 3 days because then you can book meetings from those outreaches in the next. Track conversion. Again, this is really important and good data. And if something's not working, just don't keep trying. Try new things. And there are a series of tools to use to make that really easy. Tools like Outreach and SalesLoft, they basically allow you to sort of pre-write a series of emails and then send them out at predefined cadences and then A/B test the results. Keeping track of all your meetings, super important, especially if you're working with multiple people. So who you talked to, when the meeting was, did you have it, was it scheduled, where's the call recording. We've got a really good template for that, and it's extremely helpful when you're sharing that. And then when you do book meetings, it's like congratulations and celebrate it and enjoy it because that's a win into itself. Interview templates. So this is a really important part. And one of the key inputs as part of that template is to make sure you have a well-written brief, because if you have garbage in, you're going to get garbage out. So interview templates are important because it allows you to collaborate with people prior to a meeting. You should never go into a customer meeting unprepared and freestyle it, especially if you're asking for people to dedicate some time. So templates are really, really effective. The brief should be your guide. And so understanding the components of the brief and reading through the brief will basically write the questions for itself. And I'll give you an example of that. You want to focus on facts. This is something that is obvious and intuitive, but when you're in a call, it may not be. But you just basically want to focus on things that they're doing today. Everything else can be ignored. Opinions, suggestions, perspectives, just ignore them. And if they give them to you, thank you, but they're not really useful. Talking through things that are abstract by asking for really specific examples is a good way to bring it into something that's really, really practical. And then also don't come in with like a high level, 30 questionnaire and pepper the person. You kind of want to know your high level areas that you want to touch on. And then when someone says something interesting, you really dive deep. And so there's a bit of practice that happens here, but the next slide in the framework will hopefully make that a bit easier. Okay, so we talked about the brief. So the brief captures all this information. So you've got your hypothesis, you've got your persona, and your hypothesis is an articulation of the problem that you're looking to solve. It's really, really important to write out what you think the answers will be in the persona section, because you should be able to basically interview yourself and expect the answers that the person is going to say based on your current knowledge. And if you don't get the same answer, you're going to miss something. And so when you look at the brief and you look at the information that you need, the questions kind of write themselves. And so you want to validate, hey, what's your current role? How long have you been doing that? What does your team look like? Who do you report to? What are your current priorities? You're basically now trying to just see if the answers that they give you map the answers that your organization thinks they will give. Because the hypothesis is focused on a particular problem, you don't want to dive into that problem and ask them about that problem. This is a really important point, because then you'll bias the conversation. What you want to do is set it up from a high level perspective and say, yeah, what are your priorities? How do you achieve those priorities? What's your workflow? And what's the hardest thing about that? If they list the problem in your hypothesis, that's when you go deep on that problem. If they don't list that, they don't recognize that as a top problem. And so you can then probe on the problem, but let them show you that they're excluding that from their problem set. But when they do list it, that's when you can go deep on it. So, oh, tell me more about that. Why is it hard? Why did you think why do you think it's useful to solve this problem? So now what you're doing is you're using your predefined validation criteria to guide the areas that you go deeper. Can you explain the last time you had that problem? What did you try to do to solve it? What was the impact of that? Can you quantify it to me? These are the types of things that become really powerful from a learning perspective that are really hard to script, but when you have this structure in front of you, it becomes really, really important. One final thing on the template is if people identify that the problem is real for them, there's a good opportunity to say, hey, can I follow up with you with a potential solution? Because if they have identified that problem and they do think that they've looked for a solution that they haven't found, they're more than likely going to agree to that, which is really going to help fill your pilot funnel. Interviewing. So this is for sure something that has to be practiced. When we started doing these roundtables, like I would dread and have anxiety every time I would get on a phone with a complete stranger. But when you do sort of 10 and 15, you get much better at it. One-on-one is always preferred. Sort of keep it short, respect the people's time, go in with a plan, so the template and what you want to learn, and just be really focused on that. Provide some context and background, but you don't want to bias them. Recording calls, super important, because you can then go back to them and re-listen. When you're running a meeting, you have to be very active and you do miss a lot of things. So having those recordings for later is super important. Most people have no issue with that. It's all very high level stuff. Keep it really casual and conversational. Ask for introductions at the end. This makes your outreach so much easier. And then make sure you've got a good setup, because no one likes bad audio, a messy bedroom, etc. And then make sure you do have a follow-up at the end. Yeah, interviewing correctly. The more you do this, the better you get at it. Recording calls is helpful because you can then coach your team on it. But it's super simple. The principle is basically to remove bias. All you want to do is focus on what they're currently doing today and what their current challenges are, and ask for real examples. That's it. You don't want anything else. You don't want to ask them opinions about stuff. And again, this is for validating a problem, because of all the human biases that we have, like confirmation, false consensus, everyone wants to be liked. You're not really going to get good answers anyway, so there's really no point in answering. And so we find that it's really good just to focus on facts, and that gives you much more decisive, actionable learning. Hypothesis validation. So this is an interesting one where we sort of spent a lot of time. We want to make this as objective as possible and remove as much subjectivity out. And so when a prospect starts talking about a problem, it's important for you to think about the validation criteria, and you as an organization can define, if you want a good way to gauge levels of pain across different problems, a pain score that's relatively easy to assess with like low levels of error. And so here's an example of a pain score that we've used where, you in the interview, the customers acknowledge that it's a problem. You've asked them, is this something that's worth solving? They've tried to solve it before. They can talk through the solution. It's a core part of their workflow with real implications that they can quantify. And they want to pilot. These are the types of things that become really, really powerful. So once you've had the interview, your work is not done. The next part is probably the highest value component. You want to summarize the learnings. And so when you know the template of how you're going to structure the stuff after the meeting, it makes that process way less painful. What you don't want to do is have 10 interviews, not take any notes, record the calls, and sort of be forced to go back and do it all. And so you want to have this as you're actually interviewing and filling it out as you go. The way we like to do it is basically you're filling out the structure of the persona that you've hypothesized based on real facts. So what's the workflow? What's the challenges? If they give you some opinions, you can track them. If they give you some additional facts, you can score. Summarize if the hypothesis is validated or not, and then provide the criteria and a potential pain score, and then just add your commentary, and then whether or not you've learned something new. So if you stop learning new things is a pretty good signal that you can stop interviewing. And so tracking that becomes really, really important. All of these highlighted things are the prospects or the target customers' articulation of the answer. They're not summaries. And so these are actually recordings and snippets of those recordings. Super powerful because, again, you're seeking facts, you're not seeking opinions. And so when someone on your team or a developer or an executive sits down and listens to your target customer explain their problem in their own language, the impact is 100 times stronger than you summarizing it in a meeting note. And so highly recommend you use some software and tools for that. When you are, let's say you've done your 10 calls, you want to link all of those things together. And so having that sort of big summary sheet becomes really, really important to tell that story. And so, in this example, you've got a hypothesis around, a problem and an implication. You've gone out and you've interviewed sort of 10 people listed at the bottom. Here's the summary of each call. Here's a stakeholder map. Here's a persona breakdown based on what you've learned. Here are the top learnings, some go-to-market learnings, and then layering in some quantitative data is really, really powerful. And so we find doing a quick bottoms up, if you haven't done this, total addressable market just helps to shape that and helps you to understand what's happening. And it's really quite easy to do. If you haven't done it, happy to help. And then providing a really objective pain score. And so the more you do this over time, you can quickly start to compare pain scores across different features and functions, and that's a really strong data point to help you with the prioritization. And then you'll notice the dialogue within your inter-team meetings will change. Once people acknowledge that the pain is real, people stop arguing or debating priority. They start talking about what's the best solution, and that's kind of the ideal place you want to be. How many meetings is enough? This comes up quite a bit in sort of rigorous research and qualitative analysis. There's this notion of saturation, and it's basically at the point where you stop learning new things. And so if you're interviewing, all these different types of people, and you can basically predict what they're going to say, you can probably stop. We find that 10 is a great starting point because within the first sort of 3 to 5, you're going to start to see a lot of different things, and you'll start to see those early patterns emerge. And then the back 5, you'll start to actually solidify those patterns, and you'll see what the real patterns are. And then anything after that is really an opportunity to reassess. And so in those first 10 calls, you're likely going to learn a bunch of new things, or it'll raise new questions. It's a good point to sort of basically take a breath and see what the best use of your time is moving forward. The good news is if you set up the outbound engine really effectively, cranking through these meetings in a week is very, very doable. And again, they're only sort of 15, 30 minutes each, and the outbound stuff is relatively sort of self-service. And so this should not take a long time, so you're able to learn with a much higher velocity. And then finally, sort of connecting it all together, it may seem like a lot of stuff, but all the stuff is really, really useful, and it's really, really templatized. And so this is how everything links together. And so you kind of have this learning goal, which we've sort of framed as a hypothesis. Your hypothesis is really your objective, which, within your hypothesis, you're going to hit on a segment or a persona, which links to your segment. That's for list building, a stakeholder map for outreach, and then really the use case is what drives your interview template. You should have this information at your organizational level, and if you don't, that's a miss. Once you've had the interviews, you're having the calls and you're learning a bunch, and then you can link those calls to your roadmap. So, kind of customer pain all the way down to Jira ticket. You can listen to how your customers are articulating those pain points to tweak your marketing message, and you can understand how they value the implication of that problem, which will ultimately drive your pricing. And so if you're able to set this up effectively, you can make this a core part of your product team so that you're doing this for all of your major initiatives. And then finally, sort of discovery capabilities. So, this was taken from our previous roundtable. As all organizations differ based on stage, and from the interviews that we did, we benchmarked 55, 60 organizations into 3 big buckets. And so here are the buckets. So 3 stages of maturity at their back half. 50% of the companies we talked to were in this, where they really had no formal discovery structure. They triage customer requests that come in from the sales and account team, and if they do have research, it's probably done by another team. 40% were in this retain bucket, where they see the importance of doing regular research. They've set up some governance. So as a product manager, you have to talk to 2 customers a week, something like that. It's usually determined by how big the customer is and the revenue. And so they'll spend the most time with the biggest spending customers, which has its pros and cons. Again, basic customer, basic governance, and then some will have some sort of customer advisory board structures. And a lot of the leading companies, are investing quite a bit of time and money into this. So they've got clear objectives and deliverables in terms of who's doing the research. Different groups are doing different research. It's segment based. So, one customer isn't the same. They're actually focusing on specific sets of customers. They're training both the product team as well as other teams to do it. And then they sort of formalize the templates and how they share and index that. Interesting anecdote that, the companies that were in this bucket of doing this, would basically say that their product managers would spend 50% of their time talking to customers. And most of them acknowledged that they felt they had really strong product market fit, where the product team wasn't being inundated by sales requests. They were able to think much more longer term. And they did believe that it was a byproduct of having that good understanding of the customer. Contrast that to the 50% group. A lot of those companies were trying to turn things around, or had a culture where the product team just didn't talk to customers, and they had like a huge list of stuff they had to crank through and could never get their head above water, and they were spending somewhere from sort of 10%. And so I don't know if that's causation or correlation, but you can sort of make that judgment for yourself. And that's, I'm going to pass it over to Jeremy. And so, if you have questions, please put them in the notes, and then, we'll address them after.
Awesome. Thanks, Grant. So I just wanted to go through a couple of case studies and share with you some examples of what we've been able to do and work with the greater community, the product community, on putting this framework into action and seeing what the results actually look like. So Grant mentioned in the very beginning the 3 pillars of product innovation, building the outbound engine, using a consistent framework so that everybody has the same inputs and outputs. And those 2 together effectively give you scalable discovery. And so I want to walk you through 3 examples of 3 different sizes of organization that have been able to implement this framework and get different sort of results out of it, but all in the vein of discovery. And so I'll focus on a 5-person company, on how they basically can get really extremely fast, rapid learnings. I'll focus on scalability, on validating multiple hypotheses with a 150-person company. And organizational alignment is a massive topic that we learned in our first roundtable for product officers. And I want to focus on how that's been implemented at a 1,500-person company. So let's start off with the first one. It's a med tech company, sub 5 people. They started building software for the medical space and diagnostics. They had actually developed an initial proof of concept with a medical association, but that association was very geographically limited. And so obviously, it made sense to build that initial POC with them, but because they were busy hitting the ground running already with this half-baked solution, they had no idea whether there was a larger market demand across North America. They sold to hospitals, they were B2B, but didn't have a great way of doing it. And so what we did was we set up an engagement where we helped build out their outbound engine for them with various tools, tested different types of messaging, different types of channels to get to medical directors and orthopedic surgeons at different hospitals. Really quickly though, because we had set up that outbound engine, and it was basically a matter of weeks, 3 weeks before we were able to help them get through 13 to 15 calls across this new customer segment and validate that with additional learnings on go-to-market, as well as key positioning changes, which would affect how they do their initial prototyping. And back to what Grant mentioned with the saturation levels, we saw that saturation tended to happen quite early at the 3 to 5 mark and started tapering off around the 7 level. So yeah, amazing results. Basically, you can get results within 2 to 3 weeks. In terms of the output, here's an example of what that looked like. So Grant was able to share with you some examples of what a top sheet might look like. And you've got the stakeholder map over here. The persona was built out as an aggregation of all the call summaries, average pain score across all the 10 calls, interviews, hypothesis, top learnings, go to market. Each of the individual calls would have facts created, the workflow challenges, and again, back to the distinction between facts and opinions, that's going to be a really, really key one to make sure that there's separation against. Pain score, using that table and seeing whether they've solved that problem, was it a core part of the workflow, the total score gets aggregated, and then some interviewer commentary afterwards. And so, as you can see, each of these notes would to a particular snippet, and you could just play that in the actual slide deck.
The city of Toronto.
So that's pretty compelling when you're able to do that, and you would have 10 of these call summaries for each hypothesis brief. Case study number 2 focuses on scalability, and so we work with an organization that's one of the top AI ML firms in North America. And as you can imagine, machine learning is a technology that's applicable quite horizontally across multiple different spaces. They had different use cases that they wanted to go and validate and had ideas against, but weren't really sure because they didn't necessarily have the domain expertise in each of these industries. And so their priority was, which ones should we actually turn into real products and put staff against? They were under quite a bit of investor pressure. So they came to us, and we ended up working with them to help them build some sort of systematic process of discovery and validating different hypotheses. PMs and their engineers were really in the weeds, focused on executing the existing roadmap, didn't really have the skill set nor the time to be able to do pure open-ended market discovery to gain a little bit of domain expertise. So we showed them what the brief template looked like. They were able to write some briefs, helped them set up their outbound engine, ran the frameworks to collect facts, not just opinions. And then they presented the top sheets from each of those hypotheses at a quarterly stage gate. So results were quite incredible, actually. Within a month, client had done 3 hypotheses where 1 was validated, 2 invalidated, which ended up leading to the go, no-go efforts on whether they would fund those initiatives and put staff against them or not. So I'll share with you what these top sheets look like. You would, again, have the stakeholder map, the persona, average pain score, clearly invalidated here. Nobody really cared about this problem. And similarly over here, it just seemed like there weren't a great way to figure out which customer cared about this problem. All right, last case study focuses on the enterprise. And so we worked with a 1,500, I think they were about 1,500 at the time, 1,500 person public company in the ad tech space. And they basically had multiple business units that obviously solve different problems, but they also had a customer segment that would are all pretty much related in the enterprise. They sold to the enterprise as well, and so their managers from each of these business units had their own sort of agenda, a lot of confirmation bias. They weren't necessarily collecting any sort of negative evidence, and also didn't really care for putting together a macro level objective view as much as possible. As the CPO, there was no sort of governance on what questions were being asked. The CPO didn't have a really good way of comparing and contrasting what research one PM did versus another, because they would live in different sorts of formats. And so again, back to input equals output, that was a really important learning for them. And so we ended up giving them our framework with the brief and the outbound engine, and using the discovery framework for extracting high fidelity learnings. But we also helped them set up a customer advisory board so that they could actually have much more of a macro level perspective on their customer base. Doing that, it was phenomenal, because after we established the customer advisory board and the framework, the product teams ended up adopting it, and also the design team ended up adopting the exact same framework when they were doing more of the solution sprints, because it was just a great way of formulating what you learned and sharing it with the rest of the company. And one of the things that we kept on learning when we did our first batch of 50 interviews on our first roundtable was, communicating the why factor to the rest of the company is something that product teams aren't necessarily the best at. And if you're good at that, fantastic. But we kept on hearing from also sales leaders that product team isn't able to communicate the why and provide the evidence on the particularly why the roadmap is a certain way. And so just putting all that evidence into a single clear format and then organizing it into a singular wiki that was distributable across the company really led to that organizational alignment. And so I'm just sharing with you a quick example of what that looked like. It was just a Google Sites implementation, really quick. Nothing crazy, put the top sheet at the top on each of the pages, and then you'd have a series of customer interviews that you could dive into in each of the call summaries with all the snippets and the learnings and the call transcripts. So that's it for me for the case studies. I want to leave you all with useful templates and tools, and before we open up to question and answer. And so we'll be distributing this presentation with the recording and the deck to everybody that's attended today. We've got the template for here for you. We've got the tracker, some slides that you can use as well as a template, and also have included a scorecard, which will allow you to sort of benchmark yourself against all these other companies that we've done benchmarking against. So with that, I'll pass it back to you, Grant, see if any questions have come up.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, so we've got a bunch of questions. So first question, list building. What is the rationale for the final number of contacts you want to meet with? Yeah, I think there's two parts to that question. It's like, how do you figure out how many contacts you need, and how do you figure out how many interviews you need? There's no right answer. You have to use your judgment. To book a certain number of meetings, you have to assume some conversion rate based on outreach, and then you use that conversion rate to figure out how many contacts, and then you get the meetings. Like we said, 10 meetings is a good starting point because it helps you get a lay of the land and figure out what you have to do next. Next question, really interesting one. What about problems that exist, but people muddle through them daily without acknowledging it? Some of the best products have come from problems that are clearly observable to outsiders who pay attention, but a bit opaque to people in the day-to-day. Yeah, it's a really good question. The problem that the hypothesis that we took you through is like really specific pain point, but there are sort of big improvements. I think the methodology is the same, but the validation criteria would be a bit different. So for example, we did a project where we looked at how pathologists review colon polyp slides, and they were doing that manually. They didn't really acknowledge it being a big problem, but with some machine learning, they could do it 10 times faster. And so in there, you're making a bit of a judgment call that would be valuable to them given their current workflow. And it's also really important to understand people's incentives and priorities. And the only way that you can do that is by having these types of research conversations. But yeah, a good question. I mean, we don't want these templates to feel very, very rigid. They're something that can be malleable based on your objectives and your opinions and what you think. Is research fast enough? Is it delaying releases and launches? Yeah, this is a quite interesting question. If you're releasing stuff without research, I think the potential is much more significant than any delays. However, if you are planning and you've got this sort of machine or this capability built within your organization, there's no reason why your product team, even an individual product manager, can't do 10 interviews a week. And so I don't think it has to be. If it takes you too long to set it up and people aren't doing the work, sure, but then that's more of an executional issue. Next question, how much time would researchers spend doing something like this? I would, based on the research that we did on Roundtable number 2, which is available online, we see PM teams spending about 15% of their time. At least that's what they identified with. I don't know if that's actually true. It's like beer. People say they drink 4, but they really drink 12. So let's assume it's 15. The data point that was most interesting was people wanted to spend a lot more time. And so the exercise there was, what low value tasks can we cut out of a product manager's workflow so they can actually spend time talking to customers? Next question, when would you introduce prototyping in this process? Could it be part of the interview? Yeah, really good question. You use your judgment here, but step one is getting the person to identify that there's a problem. And once they've done that, they've identified as a potential customer, and you can position that you have a solution, and would they be willing to see that? So depending on how the call goes, you can either do that on the call, or you can set up a follow-up call afterwards, or come back in a few weeks. But for sure you can do that, but only with the customers who identified it as a problem, and not And do that after you validated the problem so you don't bias the interview. How do you recommend working with the sales team to maximize output for both sides and avoid misalignment? Yeah, really good question. Nothing pisses a salesperson off more than a product person reaching out to one of their clients, talking to them without their knowledge, and then not following up with anything. You need to understand the salesperson's objective in the company is to close deals and build relationships with those customers. And if you're not helping them do that in some capacity, they're not going to want you to go near their client. And so you have to show them, A, what the value is to the company internally. And so when you as a product team do this research, you have to feed that research back to the sales organization and explain to them how the product is going to address what you've uncovered through the research, so they start to understand the machine. And then you also have to show value back to the prospect. Or to the customer. The number one complaint that we get from salespeople is all of these product people interview my customers, they talk to them, and then they never follow up to them. And that's obviously a problem because the customer is left hanging. And then you also have to manage the channel health. And so usually in an organization, there's a handful of clients that are super friendly and will talk to anyone. Those clients tend to get abused. Everyone will talk to them. No one will follow up with them. And that's something that you want to avoid. Last question. I'm wondering if it's necessary to add some quantitative methodology to really validate problems. I thought that interviews with 10 people is more about understanding the problem in context, but less validating the problem is there. What's your take on that? Really good question as well. This is by no means an exact, rigorous academic process to validate research that is peer-reviewed. This is all about reducing or increasing probability that you're going to build a meaningful product. And so, building a product without talking to any customers is generally a bad idea. Could you get a good outcome? Maybe. If you talk to one customer, is that better than no customers? Yes. And so you kind of want to take it with that approach where if you don't have a good idea of your persona and the problem that you're solving, and you can't articulate that clearly, you need to get to the state where you can do that. And then after you've done that, you've got to take some risk. And you're launching products, you're targeting the market, you're getting feedback, and you're learning every time you go. And so this notion of continuous discovery that is embedded in that team becomes really, really important. And when you layer in quantitative stuff, once you've got customers, is obviously really important. So why do they like you? Why do they don't like you? That's just going to make your job easier. But then also the market stuff. And so if you come up with a hypothesis that chief product officers really struggle with doing customer discovery with their team, you validate that with 10 interviews. Then you got to understand how big the market is, how many potential customers are there out there, and then what percentage would you have to acquire to build a meaningful business, and what would you charge them? And so the quantitative stuff is still there, but again, it's going to be some level of hypothesis with some probability that it isn't right. And you're building this discipline to try to get closer to the truth week in, week out, and you're trying to get a little bit smarter. That's it for the questions. Thank you so much for the time. We did send out a survey. Please respond to tell us if this was useful or not. And if we can help in any way with this material, just let us know. Happy to share. So thanks, everyone, and have a great rest of the day.